Now it's official. Commissioners, you received late yesterday a revised spreadsheet. Camille can throw it up on the screen of to where we are right now. I, based on our conversation yesterday, I reached out to Kevin Kelly with Peasley Tech and the folks at BTBC to be here early this morning to talk to us a little bit about those two things. I don't know if you have any questions on the spreadsheet before we just have them be prepared for questions or responses.
I think it would be helpful if we could just put the spreadsheet up on the screen.
Yeah, we're getting there. She's got to get in the Zoom too. I can kind of walk us through where we are at this point, if that would be helpful once we get it up.
Yes, please.
If I can. Oh, I can move you over. You have to turn on your video first. Yeah, it will. Yeah, I don't think it'll share screen if you're not sharing your video. Oh, that's weird. Yeah. Okay. In the share screen is the current status of the 2022 budget deliberations. At the top there, you see the proposed mill levy that it was in the initial proposed budget that I gave to you was close to 48,0176. It was actually a little bit off based off of some of those revenues that we talked about. So there's a comparison to the current mill levy at 2020 of 46.43, what I proposed, and then where currently in the blue column is the current results as to where the commission is currently standing. In my review of what we added and subtracted, this matches up to that conversation. I think I was a little surprised that the plus minus was only 138,000 on the criminal justice operating, but there you added some things back in that I had proposed. So we've checked it a couple times. So what that really means though, is that what remains in that line item is the difference between $691,298 and $138,455, which is around 500,000, still on that line. And then unless commissioners see, we went ahead and changed a little bit how the commissioner's line item worked for indigent defense, just to try to make it clearer. So you see there that we subtracted 50, if you want to scroll down, Cami, to that. Maybe. Okay. So we subtracted 50,000 from the drug court line. We just went ahead and subtracted the 200,000 from indigent defense and added a new line of 425 to reflect. Otherwise, we were getting it double added. So it's just easier to do it this way. And then you see the line, the movement of the Heartland Health line of $227,003. And then if you look under district court, which is just a little bit farther down, you'll see the subtraction of 175,000. And that should have us, because we're pretty confident that that's where we need to be for the commissioner's lines for those three projects. And then You don't show any. Okay. So we have the yellow highlights kind of reflect areas that we want to come back to. So what you see above, we had a yellow highlight on the Housing Stabilization Collaborative. We have a yellow highlight on the BTBC. We have a yellow highlight on Lawrence Douglas County Planning. And we show in the note on the side, we're showing that the revised number from city planning is $65,666. And as we got into that spreadsheet a little better yesterday afternoon. What that number reflects is that the new positions, roughly 320,000 in new positions, was subtracted from that budget. But then the 10% fee was added in, the 10% administrative fee at 16%, which is roughly 1/6. So this number of 65,000 is relatively reflective as the way without the new positions. I think we should strongly consider including this in our budget until we get the agreement worked out and make those determinations. If the agreement were not to change and we were not to be responsible for new positions, I believe we would be responsible for the 65,000. So I think that's a decision point today as well. And then we highlighted Peasley. We kept, just because you asked to have Peasley come talk today. And then we still have a yellow highlight on non-appropriated, which is fund balance, just in case you guys have questions at the end on that. So.
Could we start with that planning
Yes.
piece?
Great.
Because I
Let's do
think
it.
that may be pretty quick and easy. I would suggest that we fund that 65,000. How are my fellow commissioners feeling?
I think I'm good with that. I mean, I trust Sarah's recommendation, that right now that's the best course.
So I just want to make sure I understand. This is a 10% fee that we're basing off of our fire medical agreement, but not something that's in our current agreement now. Right? And we haven't established any administrative costs for emergency communications or any of that. So we're agreeing to this 10% fee.
We have given them a 10% fee.
Okay, then I'm good with it.
Oh, I'm not, wherever you'd like to start is great.
I'm comfortable starting with either of those. I mean, I think it's really important that we frame this conversation around having a conversation around economic development funds and the economic development funds of our county. Yesterday, we started that conversation around thinking about economic development funds from BTBC and things that really focused on potential high income jobs in our community. I think that Commissioner Kelly also wanted to bring in the discussion of Peasley Tech. Peasley Tech is in a bit of a different position, focusing on economic development with living wage jobs and bringing in existing businesses, but also attempting to move on to a separate taxing district all on their own and kind of looking at that through the state level. So we are in a position of continuing to fund Peasley Tech until they move into their own taxing district. Do we want to start with BTBC or Peasley? Do commissioners have strong feelings or any feelings?
I don't know.
I don't really have a preference.
Let's start with Peasley.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioners, there's a separate tab for the Peasley budget, right? under Peasley Tech, if you want to. Yeah.
Do we want to just ask questions or? Yeah,
I just told Kevin to be prepared for any questions you might have.
so Kevin, if I can begin with some questions. So if you could just walk us through the fund balance that is for Peasley Tech, that sort of jumped out at me when I was looking at your budget materials. It continues to increase. Can you just walk us through that a little bit?
Sure, and the thing that in our programs is that we actually incur the revenue before the expenses. In some case, years worth. Like for example, we're doing a mechatronics robotics program with several companies here in town. We received the revenue from that, and but we have like 900 hours, 3 years of related expenses to pay out on it. So as we've grown in our programs, our balance increases, but so does our liability over time. I'll use the robotics one again. We received this revenue for these 3 cohorts for the program. And right now we're incurring the expenses of actually acquiring the robots and building robotic simulators, and then of course the instructional costs related to it and the facilities costs related. So as we grow our programs, that balance will grow, but it's and maybe there's a way we should present that to show that it's encumbered. I mean, a significant amount of this is encumbered over time. So that's why the ending balance continues to grow.
Kevin, do you have a sense of how much of it is encumbered and
How much what? I'm
how
sorry.
much of the ending balance is encumbered with future expenses?
It's probably in the neighborhood of $650,000 right now by the time we figure, and that's not applying overhead figure. That does not cover, me and our employees. That's just the instructional and equipment related costs. If you add on another 15% for overhead per program, which is what we kind of do, you'll see that most of that money is actually encumbered over the next several years.
Kevin, can you give us a little bit? Originally, when Peasley opened, it was 400,000 from the city and 400,000 from the county. Am I correct there?
I'm sorry, I don't remember
It was 200.
200,000.
Has it always been 200,000?
Right, it was 200 and 200 originally.
From the city and 400 from, I thought it was higher from the city originally.
I don't
There was
think
a-
so.
It was always very close to 200,000
Oh, okay.
for each. The additional 200,000 came on with the mortgage reduction.
And then there was 1 year where the city reduced its amount,
Okay.
but I believe they restored it.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. Can you talk a little bit about what that $600,000 goes to? And maybe, I see that 300,000 goes to your debt service each time, just talk to us about how that works. a little bit.
Sure. And one of the ways to look at that I look at it is what it goes to is not just the operations, but it goes to the attainment of strategic goals of Peasley Tech. And if I have copies of those, if that would be helpful. We have some, I think, pretty ambitious strategic goals to that really directly answered questions about diversity and equity and inclusion and supporting low-income families in Douglas County. These funds, and as we work towards what our goal is that in 2024 to be financially self-sustaining, and that in order to reach these strategic goals, these funds are helping us get into a position so that when that time comes, we will be able to provide any person from a low-income household in Douglas County tuition to a program at no cost. It also is helping us in improving our outreach to underrepresented populations, which is a significant part of our mission. It's one of the 5 strategic goals for the organization. So through these, I mean, that's what this funding does. It's helping us get to where when sustainability, but also, and I know that we fall under economic development in this, but I think as much as we are in economic development, I think we provide a significant social service in the county in that, to me, the best way to help someone out of poverty is to get them in a good job. And so, so that's what these funds go towards. They're helping us build to that self-sufficiency, which we anticipate in 2024 budget year. And that, and through that, that we continue to make outreach and develop programs to help support residents of Douglas County, all the residents of Douglas County.
I just have one more question,
Yes,
and
sir.
that's, have you seen, I mean, I know Peaslee Tech came to us with a CARES Act proposal when we did CARES Act. Have you seen the impact of COVID-19 on the types of training or the expansion that you want to do for Peaslee Tech?
Actually, I think it was, we learned during this time and that we were doing programs that were really needed already. And so we've had a lot of people through funding from the CARES Act that were, you know, there's one young man that was, he worked in a restaurant for 17 years, you know, good employee. They kept him. He was the last one they let go. Well, he knew that he couldn't count on that for the rest of his life, you know, so he's now training to be an electrician, and he'll have all the work he ever wants, and he'll have a career for life. So we found that that the need for people in skilled trades has been extremely high, even during the pandemic. All the construction folks were working during that time. All the people that we have that are in medical settings were working during that time in training programs. It has led us to expand some programs, like our welding program. Is the Board of Regents last week approved another level of welding for us, and then an independent robotics technician program. And that is a result of hundreds of robots coming in. I know it sounds like an invasion, but we have hundreds of robots coming into Douglas County. And if we're able to train Douglas County people to repair and operate and install those, it'll help us overall in our economy, but it'll certainly help those individuals as well.
Kevin, could you help expand on that a bit? You talked about kind of hundreds of robots descending on Douglas County, but what is the role of Peaslee Tech in encouraging established businesses to relocate to Douglas County?
Actually, we have been a very active partner with the EDC. For example, the modern manufacturing that came into Eudora. We were a very important part of that recruitment. The people from that company came and spent many hours with us, and we began developing programs with them to support them when they got here. Likewise with Pretzels Inc., we actually held they held interviews in our space to get their first employees, and we've also been developing programming with them to get their employees trained up. So I think that, many years ago in economic development, the first thing most companies asked was, what kind of incentive do you have for me? Now it seems the first question is, can you provide me a workforce? And And so I think that's where Peasley's role is being able to a pipeline to support for companies, not only new ones coming in, but to help our existing companies as well. We do, this year we'll train several hundred people from established companies that are already here in Douglas County.
Kevin, I don't have any questions. I don't think, I just wanted to comment that I appreciate Peasley Tech's intentional decision to center people of color and to center marginalized communities, and to really speak to that. I've seen that in action in our community, and I just want to, while you're here, offer that feedback that I appreciate that. I think that's been really intentional work to make sure we are reaching out to and providing support for communities of color to get different job opportunities, and think about economic development at a variety of levels. So I just appreciate your work in that and seeing that those are goals that are really cemented in the work you're doing for the future years.
And it is very important, and we've had great partnerships to help us. For example, the CARES funds that we receive, our enrollment in underserved populations was 3 times the county rate population percentage. And so it's, if we can't do this, we shouldn't be doing anything.
So my question about the impacts of COVID-19 was partially a little bit of an ARPA pick to see if there was possibilities. Is $400,000 enough to do what you want to do, or do you need more?
I think given the other funds that we've been able to receive, we've received from organizations, and also as our revenue from tuition has become a bigger and bigger part of our funding, I think that we're well positioned to help, support the businesses, but also the individuals seeking to have new careers at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we want to consider that budget line item before we move on to BTBC?
I think since we've sort of lumped this all, I think just to get the picture of economic development and what our role is in Douglas County, what we want our role to be, I think it'd be good to put them all together and then discuss that budget line.
Sure. If you'd like to come on up to the podium.
We're gonna try to squeeze 2 of us in here. Hope that's all right.
Just as long as whoever's speaking is closer to the microphone.
All
There
right,
you go.
got it.
And you can lift it up. Yeah, it's all, I know, you got, when tall folks come, it's hard.
So I don't know, Sarah, you proposed that we come in and talk about the impact of the cut. I don't know if that's
Yes.
where you want to start, or if
I-
you want us to start with a statement, or
I think that we could
Questions?
start with questions like we did with Peasley Tech, if that's
Okay.
okay with you.
I think that's fine.
As Commissioner Kelly asked with Peasley Tech, we kind of have an overview of their budget and where some other funds are coming from. We know that there's quite a bit of investment in BTBC from other community partners. Can you tell us kind of what percentage of your overall budget comes from the county, the city, KU endowment, and other sources of income?
Sure. So our stakeholders provide us, and our stakeholders are the county, the city, the university, and the Chamber of Commerce. And so all of those partners play a role in funding. And the county has typically been 200 for operational funds, the city's 200, the university's 200, and the chamber's been between $20,000 and $30,000 a year. So that's kind of what we consider our public funding. That's about 35% of our revenue on an annual basis.
In addition to operational funding, what about assets?
We have the building on West Campus. So that's a 57,000 square foot building, about $15 million asset. We still have some debt on that. And so we're paying on that, but that supports kind of the company space needs that we have. So did that answer your question? And then we're building phase 3. So we leverage some funding from the county and the city, who both contributed $375,000 We leveraged that at the state level from the Department of Commerce, who gave us 425,000. And then we took that and leveraged that at the EDA, federal government, for an $8 million, almost $8 million investment in a $22 million building that we're building out there now. And so the rest of that, the gap between the funding that we raised and the cost of the building is financed as well. Jump in whenever.
When we spoke with you earlier this year, we talked a bit about kind of data collection around folks that you support and how the work that you do kind of impacts communities of color. And particularly given that this is a area where people of color have been traditionally excluded from biotechnology as a sector. I was a bit disappointed to see in your discussion of equity that you focused on non-white as a term. When we use the term non-white, it's really focused from a deficit-based perspective and not really recognizing the way that people have been systemically excluded and not recognizing that there are many of us who are people of color from mixed descent. And so thinking about what is an exclusion versus inclusive way of centering people when we have those conversations. Can you tell us a bit more about your goals around inclusion of the BIPOC community and how you're pushing back against the systemic marginalization of people of color from your sector?
Yeah, I appreciate the criticality around word choice and the sensitivity to that. And we certainly, you know, have tried to be as inclusive with our actions and our behaviors as we can be. And I think that's resulted in 40% of our companies being minority or women-owned businesses. And so then, you know, that's obviously a look backwards, maybe more importantly is a look forward, which I think you challenged us to do in our last meeting. And I think, you know, we have incentive funds in terms of identifying companies and ideas and generation that we put forth, and 25% of those funds in the future will be towards kind of the BIPOC minority communities and looking for opportunities to enhance those companies within the BTPC family and portfolio. And you know, we look at things even like we have a recent company who has chosen Douglas County and the BTPC as a home that does young workforce development, primarily around IT coding and development. And we've looked at that from the standpoint of assisting them with scholarships for the underserved community to participate in their program. And, you know, we're looking for exciting that they made a choice to come to the BTPC and Douglas County this week. So we look forward to enhancing that. And I think we look at opportunities like that with every company that wants to take advantage of the resources that the BTPC has.
Could you disaggregate those numbers for me? You said 40% were women and minority owned businesses. How many of those are businesses that are owned by people of color, regardless of gender?
I would have to go back and do the research, but I mean, certainly it is a much lower number than that, probably.
Just from a representation standpoint.
Yeah, it's probably
Our
comparable to
population's
the
over
city
half
and the
women.
county's number of, and so it might be, call it a handful of companies versus the larger number that's minority and women owned both.
Yeah, I guess.
Think about it, we have 61 companies today. So if 40% of those are minority and women owned businesses, maybe, you know, call it a 2 to 3 would probably be in that bucket, but I'd certainly want to go back and validate that and provide you an answer.
I think I missed the question.
Oh, it was more a question over overall representation, because when we say that 40% are women and minority owned, over 50%, roughly 50% of our population identifies as women. And so I'm just wondering, kind of from a representation standpoint, then, how many of those are owned by white women? How many of those are owned by people of color, regardless of gender?
Yeah, I don't think we broke it down in our metrics. But we can certainly go back and look at that. Yeah.
I'm curious if you can speak to the companies that have stayed and made a home in Douglas County. So you just mentioned one that made a recent decision, but can you talk to us about any numbers related to how many folks have incubated their companies here and how many folks have stayed or transplanted themselves outside of Douglas County?
Yeah, all of our numbers include graduates. So in that 60 companies, there are graduates. I think that the number's around 12 at this point. And we consider a graduate, a successful graduate, and one that's included in our number is one that stays in the region. So anybody, if somebody were to up and leave and go to Silicon Valley, then we don't consider that a successful graduation, and that's not in our number. And so we have, of those 12, they're all in the region. So there are several in the community that have graduated out. Some of the issue we find, our companies want to be close to the university, and so proximity to the university is important. And so we try not to push them out if they want to have that proximity. And the other kind of barrier to getting them out in the community is we have a lot of highly specialized wet lab space. It's really expensive to invest in. There's no inventory in the region. And so if we're not investing in that, we're at risk of losing those companies to other communities who have that wet lab space and likely going to be in Austin or on one of the coasts to find that space. And so we think it's really important to have that inventory, have that space for them to grow. And so that's another reason that, some of those companies do stay in our buildings on West Campus.
And so when we say graduates in the region, that may not necessarily be Douglas County, but the broader regional community.
Correct. So we consider, Northeast Kansas kind of the region. We operate the incubator out of the Med Center as well. And so that's kind of part of our system. It's a smaller part of our system, but those companies over there are also kind of included in that number as well.
What kind of wet lab space do we have that's not on endowment owned or university owned property that may kind of contribute some of those businesses contributing to our property tax base, our commercial property tax base in the area? Do we have anything that's not on endowment owned land?
In terms of, I think there are companies that have those capabilities in that space, but I'm not quite sure what the inventory looks like. I know that if you were to search for wet lab space in the community, you're likely not going to find any that's available. And it's hard to find somebody that can produce it quick enough to meet the demand. And so if you don't have it in inventory or you're not building it, then you're probably going to miss opportunities to keep some of these companies growing.
So you spoke about businesses that have been in the incubator and moved into the region. I was under the impression we had some that were in Douglas County. Is that
We did,
incorrect?
yeah.
Can you share some of that? I think that was, I don't want to say that was Commissioner Reed's question, but I want to make sure that that's heard.
Yeah, and so Sunlight is an example. They were early occupant. They now have a building out on Wakarusa in Bob Billings area. Creditech was in the BTBC system. They have invested in facilities in North Lawrence. 360 Energy Engineers is a company that was in BTBC, moved downtown. And so those are three examples that I can think of right off the top of my head that have moved into the community and occupy commercial space.
So could we circle back to the question that I think you brought up at the beginning? What kind of impact would a reduction in county funding have, given the investment from a number of other sources that BTBC has?
Well, I think starting, and Adam will jump in, I think for us, the operational funding that you all have provided has provided such success in terms of that company base and the job growth. I mean, we've even, we have 445 jobs, that's 66 jobs over last year. Even during COVID, the companies that chose the BTBC have grown 12% in their job growth. And so the monies that you all have provided, a lot of those obviously they go to the facilities and the operations, but they go to provision of business management services to companies who may not have the resources to be able to pay for those services. And so think about things like financial accounting, competitive analysis, market research, grant writing, those kind of things. A lot of that comes on our team, and we use the funds that you have done to address that. And then secondarily, the other piece that it impacts is potential future match funding from outside sources like the EDA, like the Department of Commerce, like Adam spoke to relative to the monies that were generated for phase 3 that's going on now. But for a real life example, we have $1.5 million grant right now outstanding with the EDA based upon the funding of our stakeholders that is meant for early stage companies and startup companies around some of those programming services to enhance their ability. And so, certainly at a minimum, a decision today by you all weakens that message around economic development and the drive for helping those companies. What that ultimate impact for us is obviously, until the 2022 budget on our side gets determined, we don't know how that's going to directly impact the level of service we can provide.
Yeah, and just to add on, like he said, we've always tried to leverage our community support to go out and raise additional funds, to bring in investment from outside at the state level or the federal level, whether that be EDA, the SBA at the federal level. The Kansas Department of Commerce has been really important in helping us build out infrastructure. And so, like you said, it's just the leverage component of going out and raising those funds. It's really important to have the local funding, and it's important to those partners to see that there's local investment in the same kind of initiatives that they want to invest in.
So Peaslee Tech spent some time talking about their move towards being self-sustaining by budget year 2024. You've had quite a bit of investment from local partners, as well as the state and federal investment, as well as endowment through KU. Do you have a plan to move towards self-sustainability or towards kind of reinvestment from some of these graduates that have received quite a bit of government support, public dollar support?
Yeah, in terms of reinvestment from companies, we don't take any equity, so there's no expected return from them. Hopefully, if they grow big enough, they would want to build a building themselves here and grow their company here. That's the ultimate goal. In terms of the money that we've raised, all of that has really gone into infrastructure. You think about the EDA, it's going into a building, so it's not really operational support to support the services that we give the companies. It's more of the infrastructure to house the companies that need the space. And so as we move on and look at phase 4, certainly if we can raise a larger chunk of equity for those projects, then that just adds to our ability to move towards sustainability. And so we're looking at making public funding a smaller piece of our budget on an annual basis. And so growing that private revenue to support our operations is important to us.
So do you have a timeline for kind of that move towards less reliance on public funding?
Well, certainly it'll depend on our ability to raise funding for a phase 4. We don't know exactly what that looks like. As a nonprofit, we don't have a bank of funds that say we can build phase 4 in 3 years. We'd like to do it. We see demand for it, but we still have to go out and raise funding to do that as a nonprofit.
Just, I'm trying to think, you mentioned all those assets that you have and the investment from government partners. What happens if the BTBC goes away and those assets are still, who gets those assets?
I think that'd be it's a nonprofit. It has 4 stakeholders. I think that it would be the stakeholders would come together to decide what happens to the asset and how the assets were dispersed at that point.
I do want to point out, and Adam will correct me if I'm wrong, commissioners, we talked about this briefly in the beginning. 2022 is the first year where the bond payment for building 2 is paid off. So that has left our budget for 2022. And I think by our account, Adam, the West bond payment will in 2023, it will be paid off. Is that close to what your recollection is?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at, so the West building has been great. We're growing companies over there. We've been able to recruit companies because of that building, and we've been full on main campus for a while now. So it's an important asset for growing companies and jobs here still. When phase 3 opens, those companies will migrate over to phase 3. And our goal is to divest of that building at some point. It's not a real efficient building in terms of operation, and it's not in proximity to where we really want to grow assets. So, yeah.
But I think that will impact what our spend is in this area as that transition happens. But, it's key, that's tied to the wet lab space, which is what they talked about earlier, is that until we have additional wet lab space available, we would lose those companies today if we did not have that space available. So I think the plan was get them someplace new, better to go to, and then deal with what's happening on West.
But those are all infrastructure expenses that were not part of our discussion yesterday
Agreed.
in any sort of cuts.
Agreed.
I think the whole
provide-
commission is in support of all of the building and bond payments that are a part of our economic development funds. It has to do with the operational funds that were a part of the discussion yesterday, which are in our budget at 225, though I keep hearing the number 200. And it sounds like the city was funding at 200.
So the additional 25,000 is for incentive funding. So our budget does represent a total of 225, and that includes the incentive funding. So they would probably not think of that 25,000 as operational funds because it is used, I call it incentive funding.
Yeah,
You
it's
will have a
segregated from our operational funds and only allocated when there's an incentive awarded to one of the companies.
Thank you.
Are we ready to have a discussion of these two budget items? I would propose keeping the Peasley Tech funding the same as it currently stands in the budget.
Agreed.
Agreed.
I would agree with the conversation that we had yesterday in reducing the BTBC funding.
Well, I'm still processing, to be completely honest. I think I'm interested in taking that number down some. I think that the amount of other investments that are coming in contribute a lot to the operations, and that those are funds that we can reallocate elsewhere to Douglas County residents and provide a bit of a push for BTBC to think about that timeline of how to move away from some of the public, relying on the public funding for operational support. I think I feel not attached to a specific number. So interested to have more discussion about that and hear Commissioner Kelly's thoughts.
Yeah, I think I just say what I said yesterday, and I think some of the things I heard today confirm, having that partnership that we have with the city and the county and it does help us leverage funds. I think we have examples of businesses that have left the BTBC and are operating in Douglas County and then therefore providing revenue to us. I appreciate the discussion around equity and that I don't know that we went with that close of a lens on everyone, but I do appreciate that have referenced that they do need to focus on that more. They're not where I'd like them to be yet, but I appreciate the effort towards it. I think it's really critical that we consider the impacts that economic development has on Douglas County. We have a lot of services. We have a strong, and I'm not saying that we're not supporting them. I just think it's critical that we continue to support both sides as we try to think how to grow our community and grow high dollar businesses in our community.
I think that where I come down on this is that we are incredibly supportive. And I don't think there's anyone on this commission that is saying that we don't want to be supportive of economic development generally and BTBC in particular. Where I'm concerned is that we have over $400,000, $416,000 when we look at both infrastructure, incentive funds, and operational funds that we pay every year to support BTBC. And with some of our other areas of economic development, like Peasley, there's a push towards self-sustainability. Here, I think that it makes a lot of sense to invest public dollars in infrastructure and public dollars to bring businesses and grow businesses and keep businesses. My concern is that operational expense is big, and I'm really concerned that we had a conversation when we first joined this commission in early February about some of our concerns around discussions of equity and the lack of focus on the historically marginalized in this particular sector. And I think it is fair to say that if we're making a public investment of public dollars, that there is a really strategic vision for how we think through correcting past wrongs in an industry. And I didn't see that come through. And the attempt that I saw actually kind of doubled down on that deficit-based thinking in a way that was incredibly problematic. And we don't see kind of that longer term focus of sustainability and operations. I think the focus on leveraging public assets, making sure that we're investing in infrastructure is incredibly important. What we're also seeing with BTBC kind of as an organization is that they're moving increasingly towards the KU Innovation Campus, which is all endowment owned land and won't kind of provide an increase in property taxes for our community immediately. Long term, as as companies graduate, we hope that they stay in our region, but we don't have that kind of broader wet lab space. And so I would be interested in continuing to fund the infrastructure pieces, continuing to put some funding towards operations, but I'd like to see us decrease the amount that we're putting towards operations right now and work with BTBC as one of our community partners to really take an intentional look at how we're doing work that centers people who have been traditionally excluded from their sector and what that means for the overall economic development vision of our community. I'm not wed to the current number of the reduction. If we want to talk about bringing that down a bit, I'm fine with that. But I am uncomfortable with our commission continuing to fund them with over $400,000 a year.
Sarah, can you help flesh out that $25,000 of incentive, but like the separation of the two in our budget a bit more?
And Adam can help with this as well. You know, from what I understand, you know, we wait until we hear from them in terms of if there's a particular, you know, project that needs some sort of incentive, you know, if there's, you know, I think in some cases it's been used for some particular renovations to a space perhaps, or some sort of, you know, match requirements for some sort of other funding. And then when that happens, they contact both the city and the county, and those funds are released. So, you know, the rest, the 200,000 in operating funds really, you know, are like our community partner agreements. They go at the beginning of the year, twice a year, and are governed by that process. So much less targeted in terms of how those funds are used. Does that answer the question you're looking for? Okay.
Commissioner Kelly, I wonder what your thought about taking it down by 50,000 this year would be.
You know, if that becomes the compromise, I suppose that's fine. Yeah, I think if we want an economic strategy, I think we have to dedicate maybe a little more time in our work and in our discussions and in how we talk with EDC and how we talk with BTBC and Peace. I mean, I think one of the reasons I'm really glad we brought Peasley Tech in and the BTBC is the new format of our hearings. I think we unfortunately didn't get to have some of these discussions, and it's evident to me just listening to the discussion today that we want to have a role in economic development and maybe a deeper role than our budget hearings projected. And so, you know, if the other two commissioners feel like we need to do a reduction, I don't want to be here all day. and I understand, you know, how that works, but I do think we need to be very specific with our partners and what we're looking for and what we're asking for. And that the discussion we have isn't just a discussion at budget time, that it's something, you know, that we can talk about so that when they do bring a budget request to us, that is for the same funding that they've asked for, they understand why that reduction is there. Not that we're surprising them here, but I think we just need to have a longer conversation about it.
I 100% agree that we need to have a longer conversation about it. I am fine with that $50,000 number as a compromise number. I do think that we had a work session with BTBC, and We were very clear about some of our goals around economic development. I think that we need more clarity as a commission and more discussion of our overall economic development involvement and strategy. But I don't think that we should present this discussion at budget as a surprise. I think that the specific number discussion around reduction is an important piece for us to discuss. Budget time is when we discuss budgets. So I think that that piece is fine, but I think the overall discussion is something that I am very much in favor of.
I appreciate that conversation, commissioners, and I do think it's sort of a yes and conversation in terms of, in order for our partners to understand where we're headed and the priorities and pressures on the commission. And I think this has just been an area where we haven't spent enough time, and for the commission to really articulate in a sense that I can help share that to partners when we have conversations in terms of what our real focus is. And I'm hearing through conversations earlier this year and in this, that you really are looking at a pretty targeted lens in terms of how you see the county's role in economic development. You're invested, but you're invested with some specific strategies. And I think we can do a better job to help articulate that. And then in some ways, I think then that can be reflected to our partners that, I part of my conversation to folks yesterday is the county commission is under a lot of pressure. There are significant demands for community services that frankly, no other partner in this local funding structure owns as part of their core business structure. And that's human services. In addition to that, significant cost transfers for shared services coming from other local government partners. So those pressures are real and substantial. And I think they're uniquely placed on you all, which will force us to be a lot more targeted in terms of our strategy. And I do think I think our conversation about equity, we're, I think the county's been really transparent that we've got a lot of room to grow in this space. And so I'm kind of hearing that as well as a part of this conversation is, how do we apply that sort of lens to a variety of different sectors in some of what we do in terms of, how do we elevate that with all of our community partners?
Well, and I think we need to be very clear that elevating that conversation does not just mean saying the words equity,
Agreed.
but it means coming with really specific data. We saw from some community partners that we provide a lot less funding to. I'm thinking about the letter that all of the commissioners received from Just Food. They gave very specific numbers about BIPOC communities in our rural community. We saw very specific numbers from Peaslee Tech when it comes to service to the BIPOC community. I think we need better data for the investments that we're making as a county and how those investments play out for the most marginalized in our community.
Yeah, I think I just want to articulate around the equity issues that, that I appreciate the efforts that are being made and that that you are thinking about it and staying in conversation with us. And that is something we are asking of all of our community partners to talk about with us. And to talk about it means to center the people who have been invisible or erased from communities and sectors. And so I just want to, as a white woman, it was a lesson for me to learn that I couldn't just talk about race and equity in a way that didn't specifically say and center Black people and Indigenous people and immigrant communities, and also gender nonconforming and transgender people, and not just thinking of gender in a binary. We have to have these conversations in a deeper way. And they are conversations we're having with community partners across the board. And so I want us to be mindful of that, and that the words and actions have to align. And I do think that, to Commissioner Kelly's point, that a larger conversation amongst the commission and with staff about what the county's, economic development strategy is moving forward, and the areas we want to focus that on. It's a conversation that needs to evolve, and I'm interested in conversations in the future with the different chambers in our county and talking about the difference of 195,000 for the Lawrence Chamber and 10,000 apiece for Eudora and Baldwin's chambers. That's a conversation that we didn't pinpoint this year, budget time, but it is a conversation I want to have further and talk about equity in terms of geographic equity also. And that's something that I really appreciate about Peaslee is not only, in terms of class and race equity issues, they are thinking about geographic equity. They are they are both training students from communities throughout the county and helping bring businesses to different parts of the county and not just Lawrence and not just around the campus. So I appreciate that. And I think we need a much larger conversation beyond the budget about those chamber numbers also.
Yeah, those chamber numbers are not proportional. And I think it's important to have that conversation in the future.
So I appreciate both commissioners' discussion of equity here and I think it is something that we have, as a commission, have said is really important to us and we need to help our organizations. We have some organizations in here who, we have a few that didn't even respond to our equity questions, right? And we have many that were, I think have a lot more work to do in my mind, but I also know I have a lot more work to do on this. So I honor those organizations that are working towards a better understanding of it, trying to understand from us what we're looking for and from the community what we're looking for. And what I don't want to do is send the message that as you make progress, that you're not making enough progress. We need to see sort of what that trajectory is. And I do appreciate those organizations like Just Food that did really quite an exceptional job of providing us some data there. And I understand for many of these organizations, what we're asking them for here, this is more elaborate than what we've asked for before. And so as they learn what we're looking for, they'll be able to respond better here. And in a way that meets our commission's goals and more importantly, our community's goals.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Kelly. And I think that is where we need to be very clear that data are important. And when we are talking about these things, we're not talking about broad statements. We are talking about very specific ways in which the actions and the funding match up with the values of our community. And we reflect that through the data that we receive from each of our partner organizations. And I think that that's an important thing for us to communicate for next year in budget season.
We have consensus on a number.
It sounds like a $50,000 reduction is where we've landed.
So the last kind of yellow box I see is back under Housing Stabilization Collaborative. Cammie, if you want to move up to that. I don't know if commissioners have had additional thoughts about that as we now, or if you'd like us to look at, if we want to talk about criminal justice operating first.
I'd like to take a look at exactly where we're at in criminal justice operating and where we're at in our general fund balance before we enter into the conversation, just so we can kind of get a picture of where we're at overall numbers wise.
So by what I'm showing, and Cammie will correct me if I'm wrong here, that there's a remainder of $552,843 on the criminal justice operating line. $552,843. So that would be, and if the commissioners want, that line could be retained and into future years, or it could be used to offset mill levy increases.
I'd be interested in both of those options, retain some of it for the Housing Stabilization Fund, and then put some of it into the general fund so that we can decrease the overall mill rate, or I guess just decrease the overall mill rate with the other part.
Specifically on the conversations on housing stabilization, I just want to make sure I understand commission intent in terms of, we also have the Emergency Services Council. I think we had a great conversation during hearings that we need to figure out how we're going to blend this and in combination with the new program coordinator to help us really oversee what kind of a new program we're going to create. Are we on the same page in terms of eventually these funds need to get somehow combined, and we need a better sense of strategy on how they're going to be used. I think there is significant room here for a lot of ARPA investment in addition to this. So am I saying anything that you all aren't thinking in terms of how these two eventually would really become?
That is the direction
Blended.
that I see us going. I think that my concern with waiting for how ARPA plays into this conversation is that we're not quite sure yet. So I think we don't necessarily need to rename anything in this area.
So, and I appreciate you saying that. And I guess while you're thinking about kind of final strategies here on how we pull this together, I want to bring two other points back. One, I'm going to ask you to rethink about the conversation about the animal code and paying for the operations of that through fund balance for 1 year, and really decide if you really think something's going to happen again in a future year. I'm concerned that is a cost that we'll just have to build into the mill levy in the future, or I'll need direction from as we approach the 2023 budget. Frankly, they're not going to have had a whole lot of data put together by the time you begin work on the 2023 budget, because this doesn't start till 2022. So you're going to have less than 3 months of data, and we're going to have to make decisions about it moving forward. So as you're thinking about that, and the reason why I say that, and I think, Commissioner Kelly has said this at times in terms of this particular capital justice or criminal justice operating funds, this is a very unique opportunity to have existing mill levy available to redirect. I don't think you're going to have it again in a significant way. We've not had it before here until this time, until that work was to redirect it. In future years, this will all come from increases to assessed valuation or increases to mill levy. That's it. So I do appreciate you thinking long-term in terms of how you want to spend these funds and making sure that you are building capacity, which is, housing stabilization is one strategy there. I think the question about if there are operations such as animal enforcement, for you just to be thinking about that as you think about how much of this you want to use to lower the mill levy and how much of this you want to use to dedicate to operations.
I really appreciate you bringing that back up. I do think it's important that part of our conversation yesterday was that this is potentially a pilot with the Humane Society because we are moving this from the sheriff's office to one of our community partners. And so this isn't necessarily about capacity building for the county so much as capacity building for a community partner. And that's where I felt more comfortable around it being one-time pilot funds for the Humane Society and Animal Code, just that piece of it. I'm happy to revisit that and happy to talk about potentially including that in our mill rate. But I think that was kind of the distinction that I saw that was different than I'd like us to retain some of these funds to think about capacity building in our overall human services component. And a big part of that is housing stabilization. And that's why I don't want to completely reduce the mill rate for this particular area. So we can think about our capacity building as a county, because we are moving towards those conversations of what is our role in convening all of these community partners to work towards a more structured approach to human and social services.
And so not to belabor my point on the animal code, because I sometimes can do that. What I want to be clear here, though, is that this is an enhancement in service by a long shot. So even if we were to say, Sheriff, as we approach the 2023 budget, have you been able to sort of manifest any savings for redirection? And our expectation is that you will contribute funds to offset that. Let's be really clear here. This is a substantial increase in service. So that's why I'm talking about, let's be, and I don't think that amount is unsurmountable in terms of how we approach the 23 budget. $82,000 is not terribly problematic, but I just want us to be cautious as we approach that.
So,
And a lot of things happen as, things change.
so I don't want to get too cute with budgets here, but maybe we could put some capacity into the mill levy because and then use some as fund balance. It is one of the ways that we could maybe split the difference here so that we're putting some value into, we're probably going to need to continue this, but So let's put something there. I wondered about that last night when I was thinking about the compensation study too. It's like, do we want to put some of the compensation study into that criminal justice? And do we want to put some into fund balance? We sort of talked that through. So I wonder if that's sort of a halfway point on this as we sort of figure this out. You know, I said it yesterday, so I'm not going to say it again. I think there's opportunities for collaboration here on animal control. So I guess I did say it again, even though I said I wouldn't.
Yeah, I like that suggestion. And it was just an idea I had and I said it out loud. And so I'm not, stuck on it being a one-time pilot first. It's just ideas that I had. So, I mean, I like that approach and that we can go ahead and account for some of it and assume that it will be ongoing, but I mean, I appreciate your point, Sarah, that we won't have a lot of data yet. And I mean, that is a valid point. And so I don't know where that will bring us to this conversation in a year from now. But I think that approach makes sense. And I'm good with that for the compensation study too.
Sounds like we're all in agreement. We just need to figure out exact numbers.
Well, if I look at the animal code expansion, it's at 81,559. I mean, 50,000 is a nice round number in terms of building some capacity in there, and then we figure out if, because honestly, I think there's a potential they could come back and ask for more in a future year, and that this might not be sufficient, or it might be more than sufficient. So to sort of start off a conversation, how does 50,000 feel in terms of that?
That feels fine to me. This is where you start making sausage. Just yeah, I mean, that feels fine to me.
So then that would move so then Cammie, on the Lawrence Humane Society, could you, I guess that would be 31,559. Okay. Then I guess if we're going to talk about the compensation plan, that was the other one. And I do appreciate you bringing that back up in terms of I mean, so I was going to try to come back and look at this number when we did this in 2013. So almost 9 years ago. I think our total implementation costs were in over $700,000 in ongoing operating support. And that was 9 years ago. I don't think we're quite as far behind. We did a ton of work to get up, but I mean, and when we did that, we pegged ourselves to be 30% below market because that's all we could afford. And that took $700,000. So I do think that, $100,000, frankly, when that recommendation was in your proposed budget was just a very small starting point.
I would like to see this put back on, and if we could shift the funding from the criminal justice operations to capacity building, which I think is what this compensation study is building us towards, I would be in favor of that, which I think it does mean move it up to the administration budget. So move some of that allocation up to the administration budget so we can think about long-term retention of employees for our county.
Yeah, I wonder if we put 25,000 towards fund balance and 75, just throwing out some numbers there. I think I would actually be in favor of putting more money towards compensation down the road. My one concern is that our assessed valuations went up so minimally this year that if there was one spot, I was like, maybe we don't need to save now. Maybe we can do 125 next year. That's sort of where I don't like to, Chad's here and he uses that phrase bet. I'm not a fan of that phrase bet, but I think that's one of those things that we could look ahead to, next year.
I would agree with that assessment and had similar thoughts. So I think 25 fund balance, 75. Sounds good to me.
So what I'll have Cammy do is change this line item to 75,000. And then delete the fund balance line item by 25,000. I mean, it's not really, that's pretty small in the grand scheme of things. But we'll make that note too, that the initial payment of the study, and that's an estimate, folks, at this point, and that'll come back to you for approval, but that whatever the cost of the initial study is, that we'll take out of fund balance. All right, so
Sarah, I just wanted to say for the record about the housing stabilization and the question around ESC and stuff, that ultimately I do think it's a smart strategy for us to figure out how to consolidate and simplify the process of access to those funds as much as possible, instead of having multiple pots of money that are very different levels across the spectrum.
yeah, and I actually hope that we can use ARPA funds to help us build a good system.
Sure.
Because that's one-time dollars. How do we, if we need software, do we need some sort of process, or do we need some sort of, startup cost to really figure out what that looks like, and then the funding can control. I think I'm really excited about that as work for us in the next year or two, in terms of, and I just think we're gonna have to be really honest with a lot of our partners that this is not, we have some sustained funding, but there's not sustained funding here ongoing. Some of it is really tied to those federal investments.
But using ARPA funds for that capacity building to bring down the administrative burden of access for those funds, that's like exact sweet spot of what I would like to see them used for.
So I feel like we really haven't finished the conversation about housing stabilization. Do you feel like we have?
No.
Oh,
I think
okay.
I think we're
yeah.
still in it.
Okay, good. So I was wondering if, we wanted to use some of that criminal justice operations to set aside funds, but I don't know that I want to set aside funds for those specific partners yet. I feel like there's more
Right.
work to be done there. And if we're going to have that in that new administrative position, do we put it in the administrative budget so that they have, we've created this position. It seems like we should create some dollars for that position to do the work that they need to do. So that's just a suggestion.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
100% behind that. And I think that moving that into that administrative line makes a lot of sense.
So before and I still think we're having that conversation as to what that number is and where we end up. I know early at the very beginning, when we had these conversations yesterday, you all talked about a mill levy target number around a mill. 1 mil increase in terms of the cost transfer related to middle. So I don't know if Cammy and I, we could determine what could get us down to a mill and see where we're at. Backwards math.
Doing backwards math, right? Yeah.
I am pro that idea.
So I'll let Cammy, she's kind of got the spreadsheet up and trying to work on it.
Would it be
here.
helpful if we took like a 10-minute break
10-minute
so
break
Cammy
would
could
be
do that
awesome.
not on camera?
Yes, thank
Cool.
you.
Let's do that.
Can we also have when we come back, a quick review of the stuff that is that we currently have noted under that criminal justice operations?
Yeah, we can.
I made myself a quick list, but I'm afraid I
Right.
may have missed.
Yep, we can do that.
Thanks.
I can work on that piece while Cammy's working on mill levy. Well, let's review the criminal justice operating, so we all feel comfortable about where we're at. And I'm going to review what was in the proposed budget, so you all have that piece. The Human Service Navigation and Assistance Program Manager was from that piece. There were set aside funds for drug court expansion that remain. Correctional officer for video appearance for the sheriff, the cook, the planner is part of that. And then $500,000 reallocated to transfers to capital projects to return some of those funds back to CIP. We moved the Artists Helping the Homeless expansion part. We moved a portion of that base funding to criminal justice operating. Homeless services for Bert Nash The pieces that remain for the animal code are in there. And then the position for Lawrence Douglas County Public Health. And commissioners, like, we didn't get a whole lot of time to talk about this one. I know you have the information in your packet. I feel like I want to just be on the record and transparent about this. This is more than the equity planner. This is towards their epidemiology position and another position. The dollar amount is right at 39,000. That is reflective of that difference that they're asking us is also reflective of what they asked the city under a 60-40 split. I'm not sure if it's included in the city budget yet or not, but I just want to be transparent that it's more than just the equity position. And then Cami has on the spreadsheet the formula for what has happened from what the commissioners have reallocated out of criminal justice operating. And if you,
Sarah, can I ask a quick question about that? So in that example of we don't know if it's in the city's recommended budget yet. Can you just help me be clear about what happens if we say yes to our portion of funding for a position? And if they say no, do we just hold back that money and that position does it come back to us for discussion?
I'd say it depends.
Okay.
If the amount is small enough that sometimes the health department feels it can absorb that impact of the city not funding that piece, they may proceed.
Okay.
And can particularly because we're talking about trying to maintain some staffing
Mhm.
that after an increase in staffing from COVID-19. So I think that's a conversation I'll certainly have with Dan Partridge, that they could try to absorb that for 1 year and then talk to the city about how they could rebuild into those percentages. I would say that sometimes that happens from time to time, particularly with health insurance, because, just
Mhm.
numbers between the health department, us and the city, it just sometimes we get missed. And that's a great reason to have fund balance so that you can accommodate those one-time scenarios and try to get it built in. So I don't anticipate with a number this size that it would mean that there'd be some hold off on the positions. But obviously, if there
Okay.
was, I'd bring it back to the commission.
Yeah,
and
I was just
have
kind
it
of
come
curious
up.
procedurally because I knew there's an emergency communications line item too that
Right.
is part us, part city. So just wondering what that looks like if we don't both approve funding. But sounds like there's a variety of, it's circumstantial.
Yeah, on the communications office, I have gotten some initial indications from the city that those positions are included. I've, all magic 8-ball, all signs point to yes. All right, so then Cami has highlighted the cells here, and I think she's probably located to start at the top of them. Okay, so you see Just Food, the STA Care Center, Trinity, the Willow. We kept out the whole mess on commissioners because we think that it's reflected in the spreadsheet and it was included in the base. So honestly, I think we're fine. But that's and then the new position for the county clerk. The reductions, you see a negative number there of the Heartland Radak embedded IC coordinator for criminal justice services, adding in the planner or the programmer for district court. I think that's it. Yep, that's it. The animal code. So then Cami looked at, let's go back up to criminal justice operating. So we're showing that as that there's a remaining amount on that line item of 600. And the cost to get us to a mill.
Is 621,142.
So the question is how, if since we're trying to back into a number on housing stabilization, how close to a mill do you want to be?
Part of this is also our general fund balance, and do we want to keep it
Yep.
at its current rate? And I am comfortable with lowering it a bit. if it helps keep us closer to that mill rate and still allows us to set aside some funds for our broader strategic visioning around housing and human services.
This is where I see what you're saying. This is where I will advise against large numbers
Yes.
from fund balance. Knowing that the intention is that I will need to build those into future budgets. So the question is,
Yeah, I think that's where it's not a large number, but what
Right.
is a reasonable number? So that we don't just say, oh, there's the whole thing, take everything from this line item. Would we be
Can some-
comfortable? Oh,
Okay.
I was just gonna start by throwing out a number.
Go ahead.
Would we be comfortable with saying, keep this line item at 200,000? And that would be that ongoing towards this. And this year, we can reduce, not that full amount, but reduce some in our general fund.
200,000 left in the criminal justice operating.
Which would mean cutting over 400,000 from an ongoing.
Wait, yeah, say that again
Expense.
one more time.
So currently we have 660, 620 something. If we want to cut a full mill, it would be
627,
627.
right?
So if we leave 200,000 in there, in this line item, then we would cut 400. Could we then cut 200 from our general fund? So for this year, we can have that full 1 mil reduction, but we're only cutting 200,000 from our fund balance.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were saying.
So just trying to think out loud here. I don't always love the discussion of a mill because it's sort of a random number. And so, I always like the second tab on there, which shows me what it does for a homeowner, and that $200,000. Do we feel like it needs to be right at 1 mil, or can we go a little bit, can we go 1.1 or 1 point something there? I mean, how do we feel about that, I guess?
I guess that the way I was thinking about the conversation is actually how much do we want to cut our general fund balance? And what do we feel comfortable cutting there? Because really what we have here is the exact amount that would get us to that kind of target number, however we want to see it. But I think that to me, the real question is, right now, I had built in some general fund balance into my proposed, we didn't end up having that discussion. So we have nothing cut from our general fund balance. So I think the real question for me is, what do we feel comfortable cutting from our general fund balance, knowing that then we would have this ongoing line item that would build us towards some budget for that broader strategic vision around human and social services. And 200,000 is much lower than the number I felt comfortable with. So I'm fine going above that. I think for me, that's where the numbers become ongoing versus kind of one time. And that's going to mean more when we talk about real dollars than is this a $20 or $21 increase for homeowners? But I recognize we need to talk about the real numbers in all of those ways.
So I, I think I said yesterday that I had initially put a larger number than I thought was necessary in that general fund balance. I think that I do want to leave some in the criminal justice operating. I don't want to wipe that out. If we took 400,000 from that line, that leaves us with about a third of what we have currently, if I'm doing that correctly. And then so $400,000 came off that and 200,000 from, or 250,000 would fully cover it and get us down to that mill. But I mean, to Commissioner Kelly's question, I'm comfortable with it being above a full mill. I just wanted to get it much further below 1.5 mils was kind of where was my real goal. So somewhere closer to a mill was where I was at. So I think that,
Yeah, and I think that the way you're both describing it is the same thing. You know, what we're really talking about is, yeah, we're all talking about the same thing.
So let me just put a couple things out there. We are talking about money into that housing stabilization fund, right? When you're talking about that, is that what we're thinking?
Well, I thought you had brought up a really good point, Commissioner Kelly, about this is funding that we're going to put into the administrative budget for now so that we can think of how that new housing stabilization coordinator can use those funds. I think that part of what Commissioner Reed brought up is really important here as well, that the emergency services funds get depleted very quickly and they're very hard to navigate. So I don't want us to say all of this is necessary, like this isn't just housing specific
Right.
funding. This is
Yeah, I would
part of
agree with
our
that.
budget to think about that broader strategic vision of
Yeah,
human and social services.
I guess I was going to,
Say it could either go to admin or it could stay in that line. I think admin makes more
I
sense.
think
I prefer
admin-
to move it to admin to be clear that this is part of our capacity building for the
Agreed.
administration of a broader human services strategic vision.
Yeah, I hear agreement there. I was sort of going a different direction. Like I'm comfortable taking that out of fund balance because I do think, while I do think there will be a demand down the road, I think we have to wait to see where ARPA lands. And so if we're taking that money for that administration line out of fund balance, that just makes me a little more comfortable that it's not ongoing. I do understand that there will be ongoing costs. And maybe maybe we're thinking about it in
We're
a
all
different
thinking
way.
about the same thing. It
Yeah,
just
Yes.
it's just, yeah.
Yeah, it's just how much are we comfortable cutting fund balance? Because that's what's going to create that fund. So really, we just need,
levy a use of fund balance and an expense.
yes,
Yep.
it's all about, I think we're all in agreement where it's going on the budget, how it affects the budget. We need a number that we are comfortable cutting fund balance, and I'd like to.
So the number of 200,000, I wouldn't want to go a lot more than that because in
Okay.
essence, my concern would be, you know, how do we sustain it on to, you know, you're basically, we're planning on spending 2023's mill levy before it's even here. So now that may be delayed because ARPA funds might help with that. But if you're trying to build capacity, you know, in essence, you know, that's kind of where I wouldn't want to go a lot more than that.
I'm with you there, Sarah, because I think, you know, as much as we would like, it's really attractive to look at fund balance as solving some of our problems. We've worked very hard to get it to where it is, and I'm with you on that.
I would agree. I think that's a smart strategy.
What number are you suggesting, Sarah?
I think 200 is fine.
Oh, so we're all good with 200 then.
Yeah, so Cami will. Yep. So. Yep. And then let's see what it looks like.
I guess I was unclear about that. So you don't want to leave anything in the criminal justice operating?
No, we're moving, I'd like to see us move to an administrative line budget so that that focus is now around capacity building for the human services and housing stabilization. So we will not have the criminal justice operating budget, which was only created for increased operations in the jail. So that's going to go away, but we will now have a line item to increase capacity for housing and human services in the administrative budget.
Okay, I follow. No,
Yeah, and that capacity is all I'm worried about. And I understand that it's somewhat tentative as to how it is in there, but yeah, and I do think that, like I said, this is, while I think this is a unique opportunity with criminal justice operating, it's also hard to navigate around. And so now there's some simplification, but we're keeping the capacity. So I think what Cammie's showing here is, all right, yeah. So we're gonna start with fund balance. So a negative 268, which reflects the 200,000 that you just talked about, plus the, and then we're gonna scroll up. Let's go all the way up to admin first, and she can show. So there's the additional 200,000 there. And then the criminal justice capital. Is that really zeroed out? That's what I thought. Right. Yep.
I just want to say for the record that I'm super impressed with it, and it makes me wish I remembered
This-
all of my math teachers' names, numbers, so I could brag to them about how much I've learned thanks to your good detail-oriented organization, Cammie.
And so the number at the top of 0.914 is where the mill levy would be.
We beat even our own expectations while
Correct.
still.
Do we need to add the mills of that 200,000 there? Because there's no,
Yep, you're right. Thanks, Commissioner Kelly. That looks a little better.
Yep.
That looks a little better.
Yeah.
So, and while you're thinking about this, let's talk a little bit about process. Generally, what happens at this point is, this is, if you decide that you're happy where this is at, we go back and check all the math again one more time, make sure that there's nothing that we missed. We have a significant amount of time then before we'd have the public hearing. This year, there's a little bit of a complexity with the revenue neutral rate. So we would want to use this mill levy number to set our response to the revenue neutral rate, which is the new Senate Bill 13, take away the tax lid, but add back in this process. And then prepare for a budget hearing. Initially, we used to do our budget hearing a little before April 20th.
August 20th.
August. Wow, sorry. So early. And so we used to do before August 20th. Now they've changed the timeline, so we will probably have to push it back a week because they gave people more time, but it sort of messed with calendars.
Yeah, there's a calendar requirement that it be between the 20th of August and
Right.
September.
So there is opportunity. What I would suggest that we do is that if this is where we're at, we could bring this back. Just make sure you all have a copy of this, and then I could put on the July 21st regular county commission meeting. Just make sure if there were any questions, any sort of thoughts, if there was anything like that, we could still make adjustments at that point. Right?
Yeah.
But I want you to feel comfortable with where you're at.
And also impressed with ourselves for the time. I mean, not that I have any experience that it's relative to, but I really was bracing myself for a full week. So I'm impressed.
I am also impressed.
I love
And-
an efficient meeting. That's love.
But this was a tough budget. There were so many moving parts. And with two folks that have never been through this process before, and we are unique in how we approach it, I really do appreciate that this has gone smoother than I anticipated it could have, as nerve wracking as it is at times. So I really do feel pretty good about where, like I said, I feel as good as I ever do until like I've looked at the numbers 10 times. And feel comfortable that where we say we are. Other thoughts, questions?
I have a question, just process wise for the public and for community partners, like what do those next steps look like in terms of how, I mean, is it just at our, you mentioned the 21st or the 28th, maybe we'll have numbers back in front of us and that's kind of the public announcement of where we are setting these numbers, or I'm just curious about process of staff talking to community partners post deliberations.
Well, normally, normally the paper beats me to the punch. And they're doing some public communication about where we're at before we're able to. Last year, we prepared a press release that we then as staff put together with changes. I would look to do an email specifically to community partners, sort of with where we are in terms of additions and changes to the budget. That's mainly what they're interested in. They don't care as much about fund balance and mill rates and so forth. So we would, over the next week or so, begin to communicate that information out, knowing that it's that we believe the commissioners have reached their tentative agreement on the 2022 budget. The hearings would be in a little bit of time. So, but mostly we need to begin to prepare forms, state budget forms, public notices for publication. So if my intent is that we're not changing things unless there's some sort of larger issue. So if you don't feel like you're there yet, I want to know.
No, I feel real comfortable with this, and there's compromise always in any budget in those discussions. And I think that's part of it. But I think it's important to recognize that if you take out the LDCFM agreement and the cash transfer, this is a budget cut. And I think that's important for both our partners to hear, Douglas County Services to hear, and also for the public to hear, that if we didn't include that fire and medical, this is lower, and that now the city has to do its work and make its determination. But if the calculations are right on my spreadsheet, if they reduced by the amount that we increased, it would be a tax decrease for everyone. And so I think that was something we talked about very early on, and being responsible that way, recognizing that people are having a difficult time right now. And I think in a tough budget time, that's pretty good to deliver. But I do think it will impact services across the county as well.
In the past few minutes, I've double checked the math, and just for math on the spot, that's the mill levy increase that is accurate. 1.008.
So please use approximate and tentative and proposed and all, thank you, in that words as we come forward. So commissioners, I thank you so much for your work in this process. We talk, I'm very happy that we're at this place for a variety of reasons, but I'm just incredibly proud of the work that we've done here in terms of getting us to this place. This is our, this is our strategic plan. This is where we do our work for a large part of what we do. I also have a long list of follow-ups for fall, which is really energizing, as we talked about in the spring. This really is my opportunity to then plan what we do for the next half of the year and into the next year. So I'll begin to put those lists together about work sessions, further study information, present that to you at upcoming conversations so that we can begin to plan that work for fall and really plan the second half of our year. I would be remiss if I did not thank our team for their significant amount of work on this process. And Cammie is tremendous at knowing how my brain works in terms of how I want these things to see and how we want to unpack things and put things together. But in addition to her, Jill, Mike, Brower, Bob Tryansky in their work this year in helping us to present budgets, and Brooke Sauer in her work with the CIP, particularly with this process, and she manages all our personnel budgeting as well. So it's definitely a team effort, and they listen to me quite frequently, ask for really strange numbers, and they do it very patiently because I do tend to micromanage this piece of the process. So I really appreciate their work. I think we're done.
Thank you all.
Thank
We're
you.
deeply appreciative of how well this all ran.